The February wind cut through the gray morning like a knife. Inside the cold stone walls of Fotheringhay Castle, Mary, Queen of Scots, spent her final night not in fear, but in prayer. A queen of kingdoms, a woman of power, a figure both venerated and vilified. She was preparing for what should have been a merciful death. Yet the night was heavy with the sense that even this final act of justice would be marred. At 44, her hair streaked with gray and her face lined by the relentless years of captivity, Mary retained the regal bearing that had once commanded armies and alliances across Europe. She was more than a prisoner. She was a symbol, a living threat to Elizabeth of Vaux and the Protestant establishment of England. Mary's life had been marked by turbulence from the very moment of her birth in 1542. A Catholic in a Protestant-dominated Europe, her bloodline made her both a prize and a pawn. She had survived scandal, rebellion, and accusations of murder, only to be stripped of her throne and thrown upon the mercy of her cousin Elizabeth in 1567. What should have been a sanctuary became a gilded cage. For 19 long years, she had been shuffled from castle to castle, a prisoner whose presence alone incited conspiracies and plots. The Babington Plot of 1586, an assassination scheme aimed at Elizabeth, would seal Mary's fate. Whether complicit or merely a figurehead, she was declared guilty of treason, and the wheels of justice, or perhaps political expediency, began turning inexorably toward February 8, 1587. That evening, Mary attended Mass in her small chapel, her voice soft but resolute. She wrote letters, distributing her meager possessions to loyal servants and commending her soul to God. In her hands, a small crucifix became both talisman and statement, a Catholic queen steadfast in her faith, even as Protestant England readied itself to extinguish her life. Her servants, long companions in exile, moved quietly, attending to their mistress without words. Dr. Burgang, her physician, monitored her, offering both comfort and a witness to the final hours of a queen whose suffering had been prolonged for decades. The air within the castle was tense with anticipation. Outside, the rising sun cast muted light through narrow windows, touching the tapestries and portraits that had once celebrated dynasties and victories. Tonight, the Great Hall would host a different kind of ceremony, the execution of an anointed queen by the hands of her subjects. Officials arrived to escort Mary to the hall, their expressions grim, some trembling beneath the weight of duty. Among them were Protestant nobles who had spent years overseeing her captivity, the Sheriff of Northamptonshire, and a cadre of dignitaries whose presence underscored the extraordinary nature of the act about to unfold. Mary emerged from her chambers dressed in black velvet, a white veil over her face, the silver crucifix hanging at her waist. Her small entourage followed, her servants loyal to the last. She walked with measured steps, acknowledging none, her eyes serene, a queen even in the shadow of death. The Great Hall, usually a place of ceremony and diplomacy, had been transformed into a stage of finality. A scaffold draped in black, a single chair, a chopping block, and barriers to hold back the chosen witnesses. The executioner waited, masked and silent, his axe glinting dully in the morning light. All preparations were meticulous, yet beneath this veneer of order lurked the possibility of disaster, for the execution of royalty was a task that could not fail without consequence. Mary's composure was unwavering. She ascended the scaffold with the dignity that had carried her through intrigue, rebellion, and imprisonment. The commission for her execution was read aloud, detailing her supposed crimes. When offered a final word, She declared her innocence in the specific charges and reaffirmed her Catholic faith, leaving no doubt that she faced death with courage. As her servants began to remove the black velvet gown, a collective murmur ran through the crowd. Beneath, she wore crimson silk, a deliberate choice, the color of martyrdom, of blood, a signal that she would die not as a traitor, but as a witness to her faith. Even in the ritual stripping of royal garments, Mary's grace endured. She knelt beside the block, arranging her skirts with the care of courtly ceremony, whispering Latin prayers. Her hands clasped the crucifix tightly, her final act a defiance of her captors. The room seemed to hold its breath. Outside the hall, the wind carried no sound, and the very stones of Fotheringhay appeared to mourn the end of a queen who had endured so much. Whatever awaited her in the next hour, Mary Stuart faced it with dignity, preparing not only for death, but for the long shadow her martyrdom would cast upon history. The great hall fell into a hush as Mary stepped onto the scaffold, her crimson silk gown glowing against the black-draped platform. Every eye was fixed upon her, the loyal and the indifferent, the officials tasked with justice and the nobility who bore witness. Her head held high, she surveyed the room with calm precision, acknowledging no one but God. For a queen, the scaffold was a stage, and Mary performed her final act with the composure that had defined her life. Regal, dignified, unbroken. The executioner, masked and silent, adjusted the axe in his hands. He had been selected for his skill, a man who had executed nobles and criminals alike, yet the weight of royalty was unlike any ordinary condemned prisoner. The ritual had been observed, the commissions read, and Mary had been allowed a final confession of faith. The moment of truth had arrived. Mary knelt beside the block, folding her crimson skirts around her. Her fingers clutched the silver crucifix, her head bent in prayer. She whispered slowly in Latin, a litany of forgiveness and courage. Her servants held their breath, aware that they were witnessing a queen die with unparalleled dignity. Then, the executioner raised the axe. The first blow fell. There was a sickening thud, but it did not sever the head. Instead, the axe struck the back of Mary's skull, cleaving bone and tearing flesh, yet leaving her vital arteries untouched. A sharp, low moan escaped her lips. The silence of the hall fractured, replaced by a collective gasp of disbelief and horror. Witnesses froze. Some women turned away, unable to watch, while others stared, their faces pale, at the convulsing body of the queen. Dr. Bergang, Mary's physician, observed clinically, noting the fracture, the misplaced strike, and the queen's agonizing survival. The executioner's hands trembled, his nerves undone by the gravity of the error. The axe was raised again. The second strike bit into the base of Mary's neck, yet still did not complete the task. Her head hung by sinew and skin, her body twitching in the final struggle for life. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, a mixture of pity, horror, and disbelief. Even the seasoned Earl of Shrewsbury, accustomed to supervising Mary's captivity, paled and trembled in shock. Mary's calm did not falter. Even in the grotesque spectacle, she offered a gesture of grace, murmuring a prayer for the executioner, forgiving the very man whose incompetence extended her suffering. The tension in the room became almost unbearable. The air itself seemed thick, as if the walls of Fotheringhay held their breath along with the onlookers. Finally, the third strike fell. This time, mercifully, the deed was done. Her head separated from her body with a final, horrifying thud. Blood spattered across the scaffold and onto the floor beneath. But death brought no reprieve from indignity. As the executioner bent to retrieve the head, he grasped only a wig of curled hair. Mary's natural hair, thin and gray, was revealed to the crowd, an unvarnished truth of a queen aged by suffering, imprisonment, and the relentless cruelty of politics. Gasps, murmurs, and cries filled the hall. The image of the once beautiful monarch, now laid bare in death, was seared into the memories of all present. Amid the horror, a smaller, quieter figure emerged. Mary's little Skye terrier, white with brown markings, had hidden beneath her crimson skirts and now ran frantically across the scaffold. Its whimpers and circling movements pierced the room, a living testament to loyalty and love amid unspeakable violence. Servants and witnesses alike were struck by the incongruity. A tiny, innocent creature mourning its mistress in a scene defined by human brutality. Robert Melville, Mary's secretary, stood among the officials with tears streaming down his face. He would later write that he had never witnessed a sight so pitiful, a tragedy so compounded by incompetence. Dr. Burgang took responsibility for the dog, attempting to comfort it as it refused food and whimpered in shock. The animal's grief became symbolic, a mute but powerful witness to the human cost of political calculation. The executioner's professional reputation was destroyed. Even among his peers, his failure was unforgivable. Contemporary accounts suggest he fled immediately after the execution, later found dead under circumstances that remain unclear. Some claimed guilt had driven him to suicide. Others hinted at darker possibilities. The assistant who had prepared the scaffold reportedly abandoned the profession entirely, entering a monastery in trauma. The international ramifications were swift. News of Mary's botched execution reached Catholic Europe within days. Spanish and French ambassadors used the gruesome spectacle as propaganda, portraying Protestant England as cruel and barbaric. Philip II of Spain would cite Mary's death as justification for further hostility against Elizabeth, fueling the rising tensions that culminated in the Spanish Armada. Meanwhile, in Scotland, her son James faced the impossible task of navigating outrage without jeopardizing his future claim to the English throne. Within England, reactions were mixed. Protestant authorities emphasized the legality and necessity of Mary's death, but details of the execution's mismanagement could not be fully suppressed. Catholic sympathizers spread word of the horror, transforming Mary from political prisoner to martyr. The grotesque failure of the executioner, the dignity of the Queen, and the grief of her loyal dog created a narrative that would echo for generations. Mary Stuart's final moments revealed more than the brutality of state power. They illuminated the resilience, grace, and humanity of a queen who refused to be dehumanized even in death. Incompetence and political calculation collided with personal courage, producing a scene both horrifying and transcendent, one that would be recounted and memorialized long after the stones of Fotheringhay had cooled. The blood-stained scaffold at Fotheringhay Castle was quickly cleared, but the echoes of February 8, 1587, reverberated far beyond the castle walls. Servants scrubbed the stone floors, while officials hurriedly debated what to report to London. Every detail of the execution, from the botched blows to the Queen's composure, was analyzed, weighed, and twisted to serve political aims. Word reached Elizabeth I within hours. Contemporary accounts describe the Queen's reaction as a mixture of horror and deliberate performance. She fainted briefly but quickly recovered, focusing on controlling the narrative. Elizabeth's advisors understood that the disaster could not be erased. and the execution's mismanagement had the potential to undermine English authority both domestically and abroad. Catholic Europe seized upon the incident. Philip II of Spain, already preparing for confrontation with England, framed Mary's death as evidence of Protestant cruelty, a holy outrage demanding vengeance. Lurid pamphlets circulated through Spain, France, and the Low Countries, depicting Mary's martyrdom in horrifying detail. The botched execution, rather than diminishing her significance, elevated her to saint-like status. Pope Sixtus V, previously hesitant in supporting her claims, now celebrated her posthumously as a symbol of Catholic suffering and fortitude. Across the continent, her death became a rallying point for the Counter-Reformation, inspiring preachers and writers to depict Mary as the faithful queen who had endured injustice for her religion. Even Protestant observers could not entirely ignore the power of the spectacle. Local ministers who had accompanied Mary in her final hours reported her composure and courage, acknowledging that her fortitude transcended political or religious allegiance. In towns across England, tales of her final dignity, her crimson gown, and the tiny terrier that had accompanied her circulated rapidly. The narrative was difficult to contain. What the English government intended as a decisive act to eliminate a threat had instead created a lasting emblem of resilience and suffering. Mary's son, James VI of Scotland, found himself in a precarious position. While he had tacitly accepted the execution as a political necessity, he could not ignore the public outrage it generated. Letters to Elizabeth carefully expressed sorrow and protest, maintaining the delicate balance between defending his mother's honor and preserving his claim to the English succession. In the eyes of Scottish nobility and the wider European stage, however, Mary's death was a wound that would not heal, a symbol of English disregard for royal dignity and familial bonds. The execution also had profound consequences for England's internal politics. Protestant authorities emphasized that Mary had been guilty of treason, yet reports of the execution's incompetence circulated widely, creating unease among the populace. Confidence in the justice system and the competence of royal officials was shaken. Subsequent executions of high-ranking nobles would be conducted with extraordinary attention to precision, ensuring that no similar disaster could undermine authority. The unnamed executioner, whose failure at Fotheringhay had been catastrophic, reportedly died shortly afterward, whether from guilt, fear, or other causes, leaving the tale of incompetence to fuel legend. Mary's death reshaped the narrative of monarchy and martyrdom. For centuries, European belief in the sanctity of royal blood had provided theoretical protection, even for deposed rulers. Mary's botched execution shattered that notion. The precedent established that a legitimate queen could be tried and executed for political reasons echoed through history, influencing events as far afield as the English Civil War and the eventual execution of Charles I. Royalty could no longer assume immunity. Political necessity could outweigh divine sanction, and public perception could transform a condemned figure into a symbol far more powerful than any living monarch. In Scotland, Mary's martyrdom inspired devotion and outrage. Catholics venerated her as a saintly figure, celebrating her courage and faith, while Protestant authorities sought to minimize her symbolic power. The loyal dog that had accompanied her to the scaffold became a recurring emblem in art and literature, representing fidelity and the human cost of political cruelty. Artists across Europe depicted the scene repeatedly, ensuring that the combination of personal dignity, violent death, and loyal companionship entered the cultural memory. The propaganda value of Mary's execution extended to the Spanish Armada of 1588. Philip II carried her image and the story of her suffering as a rallying cry against Protestant England. Even after the Armada's failure, her martyrdom remained a potent symbol for Catholic resistance, amplifying tensions that would shape European politics for decades. In England, her death left a lasting imprint on the nation's collective consciousness. The story of a queen who died with dignity, while her executioners faltered, resonated across social and religious boundaries, creating a legend that would outlive political expediency and state control. Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, had been silenced by execution, yet her death spoke more loudly than her life. From the bloodied scaffold to the tiny terrier mourning its mistress, every detail of that February morning became a symbol of courage, loyalty, and injustice. Across Europe, her story transformed from political liability to moral authority. Through incompetence and cruelty, she achieved posthumous greatness, not by conquest or diplomacy, but by facing death with unwavering composure, leaving an enduring image of faith and dignity that would inspire generations. Mary Stuart's death did not end with her last breath on the scaffold. Across Europe, her martyrdom became a tool of propaganda, a story wielded by Catholic powers to challenge Elizabeth I's Protestant reign. Philip II of Spain seized the narrative with immediate precision. Pamphlets describing the botched executions circulated in Spain, France, and the Low Countries, portraying England as a realm governed by cruelty rather than law. Painfully detailed accounts emphasized Mary's composure, her crimson robes, the repeated blows, and even the grief of her tiny terrier. The narrative cast Protestant England as tyrannical, amplifying tensions that would culminate in the ill-fated Spanish Armada of 1588. Mary's image, dying for her faith, innocent yet condemned, became a rallying cry, her suffering sanctified by the incompetence of her executioners. In France, the reaction was layered with political subtlety. Mary had been Queen Consort of France, and her death stirred both personal and national sentiment. Catholic factions used the event to criticize the Crown's pragmatic diplomacy, arguing that England's disregard for royal dignity reflected moral decay. French historians and chroniclers emphasized the grotesque mishandling of her execution, turning Mary into a symbol of virtue silenced by political expediency. Even Protestant observers could not ignore her courage. Ministers reported her calm, unwavering faith in her final hours, and the moral weight of her suffering challenged prevailing religious assumptions. Mary's story transcended political lines, a testament to human fortitude that unsettled all who heard it. The impact on England itself was profound and enduring. Elizabeth's government had sought to remove a political threat while demonstrating lawful justice. Instead, the execution became a public relations catastrophe. News of the botched beheading spread rapidly, carried by local witnesses, sympathetic courtiers, and traveling observers. The Crown scrambled to suppress detailed accounts, emphasizing Mary's guilt while downplaying the incompetence of the executioner. Yet the tales of horror persisted, ensuring that Mary's death could not be confined to a footnote in history. Across towns and cities, the story of a queen who died with dignity amid incompetence fueled discussion, debate, and even dissent. Mary's son, James VI of Scotland, inherited more than a throne. He inherited the legacy of a mother executed in a manner that had shocked Europe. His careful diplomacy sought to balance outrage over her death with the pragmatic necessity of securing his own succession to the English crown. While he could not challenge Elizabeth, James navigated the complex political waters, issuing statements of sorrow and condemnation, carefully worded to protect both his future rule and Scotland's honor. Yet the psychological and cultural impact of his mother's martyrdom persisted, shaping his understanding of the limits of power, the hazards of political calculation, and the enduring potency of symbolic acts. Cultural responses were immediate and long-lasting. Artists, chroniclers, and balladeers immortalized the events at Fotheringhay. Paintings depicted the scaffold, the crimson robes, the trembling executioner, and the little dog wandering through the blood-stained hall. These images were not merely historical records. They were symbols, narratives crafted to emphasize Mary's courage and the injustice of her death. Poets and playwrights drew inspiration from her composure, transforming her final act into a moral parable about loyalty, faith, and dignity in the face of cruelty. The tale traveled across borders, languages, and generations, becoming a universal story of suffering and grace. The psychological legacy of Mary's execution influenced attitudes toward capital punishment. The botched nature of her beheading highlighted the potential for human error, even in carefully controlled legal proceedings. Executioners, once considered infallible professionals, faced scrutiny and higher expectations for precision. Nobility condemned for treason in later years demanded careful oversight, fearful of suffering a fate as prolonged and public as Mary's. Her death exposed the human cost of state violence, demonstrating how political necessity could clash catastrophically with the ideals of justice and mercy. Religiously, Mary's martyrdom strengthened the resolve of Catholics across Europe. Her suffering was interpreted as a testament to faith, inspiring both resistance and devotion. The Counter-Reformation adopted her story as emblematic of Protestant cruelty and Catholic perseverance. Even decades later, sermons and theological treatises referenced Mary's final hours, portraying her as a model of steadfastness and moral courage. The narrative elevated her from a political threat to an enduring spiritual symbol, a queen whose blood consecrated the struggle between faiths in Europe. Mary's execution also marked a turning point in the perception of monarchy. The notion that royal blood guaranteed divine protection was irrevocably altered. Her death demonstrated that political expediency could override sacred status, setting a precedent that would reverberate in England for generations. Royal authority, long seen as God-given, was now clearly subject to human judgment, political necessity, and the unpredictable consequences of human incompetence. From Fotheringhay Castle to the courts of Europe, the ripples of Mary Stuart's death spread outward. Her botched execution became more than an event. It was a story, a symbol, a cautionary tale, and a source of inspiration. The crimson robes, the trembling executioner, the whimpering dog, and Mary's unwavering dignity coalesced into a narrative that shaped politics, religion, culture, and collective memory. Through horror and grace, Mary's death transcended her time, leaving a legacy that would echo across centuries, reminding all who heard it that even in death, a queen could wield power greater than any throne. Mary, Queen of Scots, had died on February 8, 1587. Yet her story did not end with the finality of the scaffold. Her death, botched though it was, reverberated through Europe for decades, shaping the political, religious, and cultural landscape in ways Elizabeth I could not have foreseen. The immediate shock gave way to a complex legacy. Mary became at once a political martyr, a spiritual symbol, and a cautionary tale of state cruelty. Her son, James VI of Scotland, inherited not only his mother's crown but the burden of her execution. Though he had tacitly accepted the political necessity of her death, James now faced the delicate task of consolidating power while navigating public outrage and international scrutiny. Letters to Elizabeth were measured, expressing grief yet avoiding direct accusation. The challenge was not simply diplomatic, it was symbolic. James's reign would be defined, in part, by the shadow of his mother's martyrdom as he sought to reconcile Scottish honor with English pragmatism. The eventual union of the Scottish and English crowns in 1603 carried the unresolved weight of Mary's execution. Anger and resentment lingered in Scotland for generations, a reminder that political expediency often leaves enduring scars. Religious ramifications were immediate and profound. Catholic Europe embraced Mary as a saintly figure, celebrating her unwavering faith in the face of Protestant authority. Pamphlets, sermons, and treatises depicted her as the ideal martyr, pious, composed, and dignified, even as the executioner failed repeatedly. The Counter-Reformation leveraged her story, portraying Protestant England as morally corrupt and tyrannical. Mary's death strengthened the resolve of Catholic resistance, both politically and spiritually, providing justification for future plots against Elizabeth and fueling the ideological battles that raged across the continent. In England, the execution sparked both reverence and unease. Protestant authorities emphasized her treason, yet the botched nature of her beheading and the dignity with which she faced death unsettled many. Ordinary citizens and local ministers recounted her courage, transforming her into a symbol of resilience that transcended religious divides. Her story questioned the very morality of state power. A political necessity had led to a prolonged spectacle of human suffering, a lesson in the unpredictable consequences of bureaucratic action. The incompetence of her executioner became part of the moral narrative, demonstrating that even the instruments of justice could falter when confronted with acts of extraordinary cruelty or historical significance. Cultural and artistic memorialization further cemented Mary's legacy. From contemporary ballads to Victorian paintings and later modern films, her death became an enduring motif of dignity under duress. Artists highlighted her crimson robes, the trembling executioner, and the small loyal terrier that had accompanied her to the scaffold. These elements transformed her story from a political event into a universal narrative of courage, loyalty, and injustice. Across Europe, the imagery of her martyrdom influenced literature, drama, and historiography, creating a template for how the deaths of powerful figures could be remembered, dramatized, and morally interpreted. Mary's execution also influenced evolving attitudes toward monarchy itself. The notion that royal blood conferred divine immunity was irrevocably altered. Her death demonstrated that kings and queens were vulnerable to political forces, to human error, and to public scrutiny. The precedent she set would echo through the English Civil War, the execution of Charles III, and the eventual shift toward constitutional limits on royal power. Mary's suffering highlighted the fragility of authority when morality, perception, and competence intersected or failed to intersect. Even the most intimate details of the execution, the 3 flawed blows, her calm composure, the blood-stained hall, and the grieving dog, became part of a broader cultural memory. These humanizing elements allowed Mary to transcend the political machinations that had condemned her, rendering her death not merely a matter of state, but a story about the endurance of dignity, faith, and loyalty. Her life and death became intertwined, the ultimate lesson that political calculation cannot fully control historical narrative. Mary, Queen of Scots, had lived as a pawn and a queen, navigating intrigue, rebellion, and imprisonment. In death, she became a symbol far greater than any political threat she had represented. Her martyrdom informed European politics, inspired religious devotion, and shaped cultural memory for centuries. The scaffold at Fotheringhay Castle was cleared, the executioner's reputation destroyed, and the immediate political problems seemingly resolved. Yet Mary's story endured, a reminder that even in death, a person of courage and faith can influence history far beyond the reach of any throne or mandate. Through the centuries, her story continues to captivate. The dignity maintained in the face of grotesque violence, the loyalty of her little terrier, the human cost of political expediency. Mary's life and death challenge us to confront the complexities of power, faith, and justice, revealing the profound ways in which individual courage can shape historical memory. Even centuries later, she remains a queen who could not be silenced, whose suffering became a moral force, and whose legacy echoes in every account of the fine line between justice and cruelty.